on mute this whole time. 1, 2. I forgot to do a mic check.
Oh, were we on mute?
Damn it.
Wow.
Okay, so we're gonna have to start over, and I just have to edit this first 3 minutes out. So
okay,
congratulations, we just wasted 3.5 minutes.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, at least I got my nerves. All right, so I'll kind of like recap one of it. So, well, what was the question first? Because your question actually wasn't even was muted.
Well,
it was censored.
I'm interested in hearing kind of what your thought is on what's happening, because obviously there's a lot going on in economics and in the political hemisphere, and we're hearing sort of juxtaposing views on each side. We have the left who's saying that this is a catastrophe, nightmare scenario, it's the end of the world, and the right saying this is exactly the plan, couldn't be playing out any better. This is what, exactly what the administration was trying to do. So I'm interested just to kind of hear just what your thoughts are on the whole, I guess, what's happening with the tariffs, and what is it? What I guess what are you getting from these sort of opposing sides, kind of talking about this whole scenario in very sort of generic terms when there's so much nuance, to it.
So I think a lot of it is coming, like, just to kind of recap when we were on mute, I guess you can say, is that I feel like the right, at least from like mainstream media or just like TV news, right, whatever, however you want to call it, I don't think that the right or the administration is doing a great job at identifying the strategy, like voicing that out, right? They talk very like high level. I don't want to call it smoke and mirrors, but just kind of like they're not getting into the details. They're not getting into the details, right? And then you got the left, or the left, who is kind of like talking about how like the sky is falling, right? And it's like just a nightmare scenario. And I'll say, well, from the left is like, I'm a big proponent of, if you don't agree with something, or if you have a problem with something, or if you want to see some changes and you don't agree with how things are happening right now, you can voice that, but you should also have an alternative solution.
Yeah, what else can we do?
And I don't hear that. Right. So, and I think that just goes to reinforce like how far in between the two parties are, and how they're kind of going at it on TV news, or the headline news. Let's call it the headline news. I've actually been just trying to get myself a little bit more educated just on tariffs in general. Like, I understand the basics of tariffs. I understand the economic impacts that tariffs could play. But it's a tool at the same time, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that it's really just, I think it's more of a negotiating tool. Than it is like, oh, let's permanently do this over time. Like I think tariffs can be problematic over time. I can see how it can benefit in the short term to say, hey, listen, if you don't fix this, this could be a problem for you and us over time. Who's going to hurt more, right? And the problem with tariffs is that it does end up having a sort of long-term negative impact on whatever country is putting tariffs up, because obviously they're charging, there's a cost that's going to be passed out to the end consumer, which is obviously problematic, because that means that those things become more expensive. And if we don't produce those things, then, those things are going to be more expensive for the people that are buying those things, and even if you put the argument in place that, oh, well, then we'll build that stuff here, you can do that with some goods. But there's a lot of things that we wouldn't be able to afford ourselves, because we have higher standards for making things. And then we just would, like, the cost of certain goods would just not be comparable. It wouldn't be reasonable, right? For us to be able to say, oh, we'll just pay the extra. And it'll be substantially more expensive. But I think there's definitely some industries where, especially when you get into some more technical, higher engineering level industries, where there's a lot more complexity in building the widget, whatever it is you're doing, like cars, perfect example, right? I think we can compete with cars because there's a lot of sort of mechanics that goes into building a car. So I can totally see how that could be something that we can have somewhat, we can compete in the world stage with. Robotics, airplanes, like stuff that has a little bit more, I guess, complexity to their construction. And the the standards that we have are more important in those arenas, because if you don't have the standards for a car, then the cars are going to fall apart and become like people die.
Sure.
That's the outcome. You know what I'm saying? If you don't have standards for how you make a shirt, my shirt sleeve comes off.
So here's a question for you. So like we talked about in like the last podcast, I think we used the automobile industry, when we were talking about how we move manufacturing jobs over, and you had brought up the point, if you move these jobs over and they become the ones who are iterating these things, they become more proficient in developing, in innovating, and producing those things.
Yeah. Okay? That's what we're seeing, at least in the third world.
Yeah. So my question that I'd like to hear kind of like what your thoughts are on is, so I was listening to something from Tim Cook. Tim Cook had made a mention of, I guess, just kind of talking about the whole tariffs and the moving manufacturing back over. And he brought up what I thought was a good point, was that, the type of the things that are being built for Apple specifically are very high accuracy, very proficient. Like there's a very specialized skill set from the people who are making them that is required because of the precision that needs to be done.
Sure.
And the challenge that he sees is that us moving that over here, we don't have that workforce in the numbers in which they have it specifically over in China. Like they have it in such large numbers to be able to produce that. So how do you see, I'm not saying that it's all moving over, but I mean, we're trying to move all these jobs. So like, how would you see, like, we move this stuff over, but like, where does, now we have potential skill gaps in skill and in labor for the people who we need to do it. So it's kind of like, how does that impact the overall market from a product standpoint and a development standpoint? And like, especially when we're more expensive in general. I mean, you could argue that an American worker who is less knowledgeable, less proficient, and has less skill sets in developing this particular thing than, let's use China in this example, because that's who's doing it, is still going to demand more money for the labor. So like, what happens there?
I mean, I think the skill component that's all teachable. So that's not at the end of the day, like that part of it is not a concern. Like if they can teach people in China how to do that, you can teach people anywhere. Like the skill part of it, I'm not concerned about. The cost part of it would be more of the concern, because in China, they may pay, and I don't know what they pay in China, but they obviously pay a fraction of what we pay people here. And they may get paid per day what we pay per hour here. Yeah. So and so I don't know how that's going to play out. And obviously, Apple has invested $500. Was it half a billion?
I think it's $500 million, and that was already planned and anticipated.
I know that
prior to
that has. I'm not saying that has anything to do with Trump. What I'm saying is that if they already were investing $500 million to build phones here in the United States, then clearly something in their model is saying that they can do it. Like it's possible. I don't know what that ultimately means, but clearly, as a business, they've decided to invest $500 million to build their phones here, even though it seems like it would be cheaper for them to build it in China. I'm not sure what their rationale was, because like you said, that happened before Trump was even talking about tariffs or anything. And I don't know what conversations they may have had and maybe Trump was having conversations with them to preempt them to say, hey, listen, we're going to be doing this. And then they were like, oh, if you're going to do that, we'll invest or whatever, who knows?
Well, and I'm also not even sure what that investment is going to encompass, right? Like if that 500, right? We think it's 500 billion.
No, is it $500 billion or $500 million?
Maybe it's $500 million. I was going to say it's half, because $500 billion. $500 billion seems like a lot, but Apple's a massive company too, and they're sitting on a lot of cash and stuff.
$500 billion? That's a lot.
I mean, that is a lot.
I don't know. I don't want to incorrectly. Either way,
it's a large amount of money.
It's more money than I'll see in my bank account anytime soon.
It's a large amount of money to invest. I'm just curious, like what that investment, bringing that money over for investment, like what is that investment earmarked? And I don't know if it was for manufacturing, or I don't know if it was for
like storefronts or something.
Or is it for development and research? Like I don't know what it is, and I'm not going to speculate on what that what that.
I'm not sure. I don't know how that's going to play out, and it's a good case. It's a good question as to whether or not we're going to be able to afford ourselves for some of the manufacturing, which is kind of what I was saying earlier. There are going to be some things that we're just not going to be able to compete with ourselves on. So I think we're going to have to see how that plays out, I guess. I think at the end of the day, the goal is to bring some manufacturing back, which whatever manufacturing makes sense, and the businesses will determine whether or not it makes sense to bring businesses here or to keep them outside here, right? And then on top of that, what that means for our ability to sell in those other countries, right? And then so that there is sort of more of a free access to these other countries from a trade perspective. This whole scenario is tough because there's a theory out there that one of the reasons why they're not talking about what's going on, why the right is not talking about, or at least not the right. I want to say the Trump administration is not getting into the details of the nitty gritty of the strategy, is because again, this is just a theory, and I don't know how real this is, but the idea is that Trump is intentionally looking to drive down the markets, right?
I was going to ask you if you've heard about that.
Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. The intention was to purposefully drive down the markets, to devalue the dollar a bit so that we become more competitive in the global market, because our dollar is so strong, it makes it difficult for us to be competitive, right? So now, I don't know if this is a real thing, but that's one of the ideas, that he's driving down the markets on purpose. The idea is that investments then get pulled out of the markets and get put into treasury bonds, which will then
lower the yields, allow the government to refinance the costs, reduce the interest carrying costs.
Correct.
Of the
so
government.
then that will have really I would say continuing effects out into the global markets, right? You'll kind of see the wave of that going into the global markets. That's an interesting idea. And that's a hard idea to pitch to people. If you were to say, hey, here's my strategy, guys. I'm going to completely tank the markets, right? I'm going to completely tank the dollar so that we can have some future, we're going to lose here so we can gain later. I can understand it if that were their strategy, which I don't know that it is.
Yeah. Maybe it is. Even so, if it were the strategy,
that's a tough sell.
Which is why you don't back that strategy. Because if the strategy ends up working in favor, you can take credit for that strategy. If the strategy ends up not working and these are byproducts of it, you can always you can politically pivot off of that, right? So it's take credit when credit is warranted, but don't take responsibility. I want the credit and not the responsibility. I'm not saying that that's what they're doing either. I think it's interesting that. So I've been doing a little bit more I still watch the news, right? I bounce between MSNBC, CNN, Fox, sometimes NBC, just to try and see what's being talked on the headlines. Yeah. But I find myself a little bit more so. I haven't watched Joe Rogan in a while, but Joe Rogan just has a bunch of different, and I think it's just because he has a bunch of different people on.
Yeah.
Some of them I just don't have interest in that particular area, so I'm not watching it. But I did check out I checked out Gavin Newsom's show.
Oh, yeah.
Because his first interview was with Charlie Kirk. Yeah. Right? And
he's a great politician. I don't like him personally. But I think he's a terrible governor, but I think he's a great politician.
Yes.
He knows what he's doing.
He does. And I think that that's a whole nother conversation that we can
back up. He knows what he's doing as a politician. Yes. I don't know that I know he knows what he's doing as a governor. I would argue against that, but
like I said, that's a whole that could be a whole other conversation. We can get into Newsom. What has he been governor for 10 years or something like that? Yeah. I think. But I watched his show and I watched him interviewing Charlie Kirk.
Yeah.
And then that got me on something where I watched Charlie Kirk debating I don't know, YouTube recommended it, right? Mm-hmm. Debating 25 woke students or something.
Oh yeah.
That was interesting. Yeah. And then I'm a huge fan of Bill Maher.
Sure.
because I love how he criticizes both. I feel like he's pretty. He's had his position, and he's been pretty fucking solid.
Yeah.
On his position.
That's fair.
And he criticizes both sides. So I feel like I get good discourse and debate on both sides. I'm actually really interested to hear his show comes out every Friday. They had a bye week last week, but he's got a new one coming out this Friday. And last week he was invited by Kid Rock, set up the meeting dinner. Hilarious, right? But he did it nonetheless. Set up a dinner meeting between Trump and Bill Maher.
That's crazy.
So they had dinner.
Kid Rock,
right? And I think it was like a 3-hour. I think it was like a 3-hour dinner. So I'm very interested to watch his show on Friday.
Yeah, because he definitely has a little bit of that Trump derangement syndrome.
He's got a little bit of that. He's definitely.
It's a little more. It's a little more than just like I'm a critic. Like he's got a little.
I think that it's great, right? I think that just on face value, the fact that these two people sat down at a table together and broke bread. I'm just really interested
to see how that went.
And what comes out of it. So I'll watch his stuff.
He got highly criticized for that too, which is weird to me.
But I
don't care who's president. If you get a knock on your door, say, "Hey, I got you sit down with the president of the United States." Who's gonna say? No,
you want to know what's interesting?
I don't think I'm going to be able to.
So he got criticized by the left, right? Democratic Party, and he's been a huge donor of the Democratic Party.
Oh, I know.
For years, and you know where he's never been invited? To the White House.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Very interesting, right? And so now you're going to criticize the guy for sitting down and having conversation with. I would argue he's a great interviewer.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah, that's fair.
And he may have his positions on things, but he does a really good job at being open-minded, in my opinion, to hearing other people. Sure. So you have good discourse.
Yeah.
When he's interviewing.
Yeah. And he's also pushed back against people that have gone really too far.
Sure, but on both sides. Yeah. The Democrat, he's pushed back on the super progressive side of the Democrat Party. So I'll listen to him with I don't know what the adjective is that I'm looking for, but I appreciate listening to his interviews.
Sure.
Because I think he's a good arbiter and moderator of
that's fair
of the of the discourse that's happening. But then that got me pushed to Chris Cuomo. So he's got a podcast.
Okay.
But News Nation is the company, I guess, that employs him, that he does a podcast for. But he did a sit-down podcast with, oh my gosh, why can't I think of his name? It was the Fox News host that got kicked off a couple years ago. Tucker Carlson.
Oh, okay.
Good. I didn't finish the interview, but good interview, right? Very civil interview. It's like you're hearing these people, and they don't have. It's almost kind of like you feel like you can see that there's not the weight of having to perform.
Yeah.
Because of the large corporate entities who like this. So it was more they didn't agree on everything, and they pushed back on things, but it's just good. It's like I feel like you start hearing their quote, their true positions as an individual, and so you just get greater clarity in the discourse that's happening without really feeling like you're getting pushed by these large agendas, if you will. So I was listening to that, and then that got me pushed to.
You went to a kind of a rabbit hole in there.
I did. Well, I'm just trying to get myself I don't know. I'm just trying to educate myself from different perspectives on people who clearly struck a wrong chord with me. I mean, Megyn Kelly has her show, and she got kicked out of, what is it? Was it NBC?
I don't remember.
She got kicked out because of her comments around blackface, right? Which I'm not going there on whether or not that was okay or not. But not to discredit some of the other interviews and stuff that they have, but it's just like she was interviewing. Was it the Secretary? Was it the Secretary of Economics? He's the lead person in the Trump administration who's handling the economic side of everything, and he kind of made mention to the whole thing. Kind of he didn't say that Trump is tanking the stock market on purpose, but he did mention that it's and I thought it was interesting. I'm not a fan of Jesse Waters, but he made a mention about like long-term returns, and I think that he spoke erroneously on that. But the guy,
the economics
person, made mention, he's like, the stock market is owned 90% of the stock market is owned by 10% of the Americans.
I mean,
or it was
I think there's like 8% of your average American
owns the market.
Is in the stock market. The rest is owned by either foreigners or the elite,
the top elite.
Essentially the elite, yeah.
So like the argument was first of all, the stock market's down. The stock market's down like 20%.
Right.
Which is not nothing.
Yeah.
Right. In 2008, we went down close to 50%. So like, we're halfway there. So it's not to say that it's not something to be a concern on.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you real quickly. One of the things that I'm also hearing a distinction on is like the market and the economy. Like the conversation you're hearing a little more now is like there's the market and then what's happening in the economy, and that they're not the same.
They've never been the same.
Yeah. So there's a relationship, but they're not the same.
Yes.
So like, because if you look at the data that is in as of a month ago, is that the economy is actually performing still pretty decently, right? There's not huge issues what's happening in the economy, but the markets are actually super volatile.
And so what I attribute that to is because, before, I feel like people are getting a little bit more, they're realizing that the economy and the market is not the same thing.
Yeah.
And I've never thought that they were the same. I always thought that the market was a terrible single barometer for the health of the economy.
You're involved in, like, you invest in stocks, and like you're more familiar with, like, you have a nuanced approach in your personal life to finances, right? Which the average American doesn't do that, right? They're not involved. They don't have, if the quote unquote average American that has any investments in stocks is because they are with a company that has a 401k.
Right? They don't have their own individual.
And they're not paying attention to that. Sure. They're just like waiting. They're like, oh, I get my 1%, that the employer gives me on top of what my contribution is, right?
Yeah.
So like, I don't care what's happening in the 401k. I'm just kind of whatever. I'm living my life, right? I'm not paying attention to that. So like, I would say that, the average American doesn't know the difference or doesn't think about the difference. I honestly never really thought about the difference until they start talking about it. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like the market and the stock market and the economy are not the same, even though they're definitely intertwined. Yeah. They're not the same. And just because one is performing poorly doesn't necessarily mean that the other will.
Exactly. Well, and I think that, inflation has been a thing, right? And it's eaten away at Americans' pocketbooks. It's made things more expensive. But I think that one of the big shifts, if you will, that's kind of happened where like people are starting to kind of see more at face value that like the stock market itself is not indicative of the health of the economy is that, barring the inflation that we've had, we've seen some pretty solid wage growth over the last 3 or 4 years. It's not, in my opinion, where it needs to be.
Sure.
But bar everything else, it was a significant wage growth considering what wage growth looked like prior to. Yeah. So like, I do feel that a large group of Americans, there's still a large group of Americans who are kind of, I don't want to say cast to the side, but are not partaking in this.
And the wage growth itself.
Wage growth itself. But those Americans who participated in that wage growth, those middle of the road Americans, they definitely feel wealthier. They have more buying power. So I think that you're starting to see that. They're still reluctant on just like throwing money out at stuff, but they're still spending money.
This is true.
Right? Which is supporting the economy.
I would say that I don't know that they necessarily feel wealthier. I think
it was not probably.
Yeah. I would say that they're still okay spending the money. They feel okay. They're not like hoarding or trying to like, I can't eat this month, right? I mean, that, of course, I'm sure there are exceptions to that rule. But yeah, to your point, because you're to what you said earlier, inflation is still outpacing that wage growth. So it is becoming more difficult for average people to still be able to spend the money on stuff.
But at the same time, but even if things got a little bit more expensive and buying power is increased from the standpoint of wage growth, I think that's something else that we that needs to be talked about and we look at is that it is not quote an American habit to save money.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well, so that's a whole education.
It's a whole education thing, but it plays a role in kind of how this is playing out, right? So it's like, yeah, inflation has increased, but wages have also increased. So while it hasn't kept up with what inflation is, it's not like, I would argue that if inflation didn't happen and the wage growth happened, I don't know necessarily how much you would see savings increase.
Yeah.
Savings increased quite a bit when COVID
occurred. People weren't spending because
they couldn't spend, right? And there was a real fear on kind of like what was going to happen in the economy. So people were stashing. But if people are feeling good about their wage growth and the economy is still moving, even if inflation's not happening, they're going to, in my opinion, just because of habits that have been formed and a lack of education,
they're going to continue
to spend. And that's going to prop up the economy regardless of what happens to the stock market. Because to your point, only 8% of average Americans, we're just going to use that as the number. I think that's a fairly accurate number from what I had been hearing and researching. But that only impacts 8% of Americans from a value standpoint. And the rest is...
Well, you said... 8% of like your average
American.
Yeah, middle of the road American. Yeah.
Correct. Now you still have this huge thing, and I don't know if that 8%, if that number is reflected of the average American who holds their own personal investments versus if it's the average American that encompasses also the Americans who are by default.
Oh, in 401ks.
In 401ks.
That's a good question.
That would be a good question because that. See, this is what I'm talking about, right? So it's like, we don't know. And the person who is spitting that out might not even thought about like making that distinction, but that is an important distinction.
It is. I would say that the people who have the most concern right now are people that are looking to retire right now.
Yes.
Right. But if they the market has always bounced back historically. Mm-hmm. So the question is like, if you can hold off from retiring right now, then there's a good chance based on historical data that the market's going to bounce right back. And a year from now, we're going to be in a different place. Right. Mm-hmm. So I do see that there's a concern for people who have 401ks and they're like, oh, because that's a lot of what you're hearing on the left is like, oh, people lost $100,000 in their 401k. Well, if they're looking to retire today, then that's a problem. But if they're not looking to retire today, right, then, maybe you say, hey, maybe I don't retire today. I take an extra year or two to retire and see if the market can bounce back so my 401k can bounce back or something like that. And again, that also depends on whether they have the capability or the willingness to. So
I think that's a big thing. And that's something that I thought about too. And it's like, and that would be in and of its own debate. But it's like, let's make the assumption. It doesn't even matter if the assumption is that the administration is purposely tanking the market to readjust values and stuff like that. But it's happening, and it's happening because of policy implementation of the administration.
Yeah.
So, and I will say that, right, like, when Donald Trump was running, the whole administration, the campaign was bringing costs down and making things more affordable and giving more power back to the middle class Americans. So my question would be is like, okay, well, if the strategy, because now it's kind of like, I think Trump had made the parallelism between like, if you go to the doctor, sometimes you have to take medicine. So this is kind of like the medicine, right? And it's having some de facto bad effects. But my question would be is like, okay, well, why aren't you kind of like talking about or having a committee or somebody look into how we're able to support those Americans who are retiring now, right? Whether that be through, I don't want to say stimulus, it's got such a bad connotation, but whether that's through some type of supplement or,
I don't know.
Kind of like, because I'm just thinking like, you got some people, I don't really think that it's super fair, right, that you've got people who have worked their entire lives, now they're approaching 67 and they may have to retire, right? And it's not like the market just tanked
because of some uncontrollable thing.
Like this is direct response to policies of an administration. So it's like I feel like that's a big.
Here's a counter argument to that, and I don't know that was, hold on. The counter argument to it happening because of policy. I don't know that there is a counter argument to what do you do about the people that get hurt in this window of time that have to retire, and then they're going to have to just eat the fact that their 401k just tanked, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know if there's necessarily a solution for that. That's a tough one. As it relates to like, oh, this is occurring because of policy. Here's the thing that I would push back on is that, not that I'm trying to necessarily defend Trump's position, but I do have to say we're here because of policy, right? We're in a debt situation that we have because of policy that's been implemented in previous administrations. We have the trade deficits that we have because of policies that we've had historically. And this is kind of a situation where it's like if you were at home and you're at dealing with your finances, right? Yeah. And you knew, you did the math, and you're like, we're going to be bankrupt in 6 months. Like, what would you do? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, if you saw that, you're like, I see the numbers. I'm like, there is like, if we keep doing this, like in 6 months, we're done. Like, I'm going to lose my house. I'm going to lose my car. I'm going to lose everything. Yeah. Like, what do you do? Right? So I think that our economy right now is kind of in that scenario. Like, we are $36 trillion in debt. We have, trade deficits all over the world. And not to say that deficits are always bad. Mm-hmm. I mean, but to what degree, right? The average American is having a hard time affording a house, buying a car. Like, we don't have buying power anymore. Like, we're not there. So what do we do? How do we solve for that? And, I've not heard any other suggestions on how to solve for that other than do what we've been doing. Let's do the thing that we did before. We'll just do more of it. And clearly the stuff that we've done before in previous administrations have led us to be where we are now, right mm-hmm. now. So I would say that the policies that are being put in place by this administration, well, I don't like what I'm seeing, but I don't know, like, what's the alternative? What's the solution if not this? Because right now we're literally like cascading into like oblivion. Mm-hmm. Like, the American economy is cascading into oblivion. Like, and we see that's every economist is like, Social Security is going to be done in like less than 8 years, and the dollar by 2050 is going to be potentially worthless because of the outrageous debt we have. Eventually, the rest of the country is going to be like, yeah, buddy, like you owed way too much money. Yeah. Like, the rest of the world is going to be like, no, I don't think so. You know what I mean? Like, there's going to be a point where like the rest of the world is going to be like, I don't care what military you have. Like, your money is worthless.
So I feel like part of me, to counter argue that, I feel like part of me, I've always felt that the biggest of the big companies and the richest of the richest people, I hate saying this because I feel like they've done a great job of polarizing it, but just haven't paid their fair share in taxes from what they put into the system. And I'll give you an example, right? Like, so we've moved manufacturing out, right? Let's just use companies. Let's not use I won't use individual people, just use companies.
Yeah.
We've moved manufacturing out in pursuit of cheaper labor.
Sure.
Right? So these companies, these American-based companies, have cut jobs in America to send it over to other countries to produce cheaper labor, to increase the margins of profit.
We incentivize that.
Initially. And now they're being sold back to Americans at large profit margins. Yeah. But then these companies still there's so many just tax shelters and everything that's happening that I would argue that the economic value to the United States that they have provided back to American households is not that high, right? And in the meantime, in order to support these things, like, and it's a money thing, right? Because then you could argue that it's been wasteful spending and things like that. But in my opinion, it's kind of a moot point, because I'm not talking about, we can fix that too, but where we're at right now, right? So it's like, well, I've heard numbers where it's like, if they just paid an extra X% or something, like we could like fix all of these problems. What are we at 34? What are we at 37 trillion? 34 trillion.
Just under 37 trillion.
Just under 37 trillion. So it's like, even if it were like a short-term policy, like, they do short-term like tax cuts, right? That, Trump's trying to get that they're trying to extend that, but it was a sunset, right, on that. So it's like, what if there was talks about a sunset of taxes on large corporations? Because I think one year, that like Amazon paid like 1% effective tax rate or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is just ridiculous. I mean, to me, that's just ridiculous. Like, I don't like paying taxes, but I'm okay with paying taxes if like I know where it's going and there's a positive benefit to it. But I wouldn't say, we could argue and say that it's our politicians and the people that we have up there that has put us in this debt predicament. But I would also argue that the private sector hasn't done anything to help at the same time. And the private sector and the largest corporations are the ones that have the most amount of money, right? So when you're talking about utility of dollars and how we can, I don't want to say reallocate, but how we can correct the errors that we've been going in, I guess that's where I kind of come back with like the whole Doge thing, and they're doing, USAID and all of these like smaller numbers. It's like, I get it. And I don't think that Americans want waste, fraud, and abuse.
Yeah.
But we're talking about pennies compared to dollars, right? We're
talking
about like small buckets. Like, so how can we take large bucket? Where can we help balance that stuff where we're getting the money from has the least amount of impact to any one person thing, or you know what I mean? You can take.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the argument from the administration is that if you have more businesses in the country, that will employ more people, which the idea is that give people more capability to have more opportunity for work, which will drive demand for employment, which will increase wages, right? And then ultimately people will just have enough money, because I don't know if that's a real model that will actually play out, but that is the argument from it seems to be the argument from the Trump administration right now. I don't.
But then the question would be, is like, even if we brought wages back, everybody wants lower taxes.
Yeah.
So it's like, if we have this deficit, how do we address the deficit? Even if we bring jobs back, right? And say we bring the jobs back, I think that the next thing that people are going to be focusing on or pushing, and we're already doing it now, is reducing taxes. So then, if you reduce taxes, it doesn't matter if wages are coming back. How do you address the deficit, right? Because even I can't remember the Secretary of, I'm going to call him the Secretary of Economics. Can't remember the guy's name. I'll have to get the guy's name. But he was having a conversation with Megyn Kelly on her show, and he had made mention that, I think it was him who was talking about, like, the strategy is, or he'd like to see like no tariffs from anybody.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, okay, so
free trade.
Yeah. So the whole thing is like, if you're going to tariff us, we're going to tariff you to make the equal playing field, with the goal, right? Let's assume that's the goal, with the goal being that everybody's just going to drop their tariff.
Well, remember, it's not just tariffs. It's also like non-monetary restrictions that the country may have also, right? To make it, it makes it more difficult for them
to do business in those. But even if it's dropping that, well, okay, so let's assume that they drop that too. But if the goal is to reduce tariffs in general across the board, which is a tax revenue generator for the government, and then the tariffs go away, and then we start talking about reducing taxes further after bringing more money back into Americans. Like, I still am lost at the fact that how that helps address the deficit problem.
So this goes back to
the debt problem. Like, if you're not bringing in money into the system to offset the balance sheet and to pay that down, so you're just going to carry it?
Well, so here's where inflation actually has a benefit. Like, inflation has a benefit to those that are in debt, right? Because if you have, let's say, $100,000 in debt, as an example, right? You owe $100,000 in debt. That sucks. But if wages go up and there's inflation on top of that, right? That means that the value of the dollar goes down. So it's easier for you to be able to make $100,000. The $100,000 is worth less, right? So now you have more dollars to pay back your $100,000 because inflation has made that debt worth less.
But that's under the assumption that your wage growth puts you in a position to where it's not being eroded by the current inflation and you're not taking on new debt.
That's where Doge comes in, right? Where they're trying to make it. I mean, again, this is the argument that's happening. This is why they're trying to find out, like, what. I mean, they've already talked about the Department of Education and all these other departments that are in the government as to whether or not they're even necessary. Like, where is spending happening that is unnecessary? Can we pull that back, right? So if you can decrease spending and you can figure out a way to get rid of debt, then in theory, like, the idea is that you'll at least that'll be a course correction so that you get to a point where you can eventually be at zero or close to zero debt, and the cost of running the business, in this case the government, is going to be substantially lower. I mean, at least that's the theory. So I don't know if the course that they're going on is going to achieve that, but it seems like that's what that seems to be the goal that they're going after, which is why the whole idea of, like, the whole theory around crashing the market and becoming slightly more inflationary to bring down interest rates and make buying power higher because interest rates are lower, right? Especially for larger things, borrowing power, essentially, right? To make an adjustment to the economy, like, that's why that when you hear it, you're like, oh, I can see how that could work. I don't know if it will.
See, but the only way that that's going to end up working is if confidence in long-term inflation being here goes down.
Confidence in long-term inflation. Yeah. Oh, like it doesn't continue.
Correct. Right. Yeah. So we'll use the 10-year treasury, right? Right now, inflation is happening, right? We'll say there's short-term inflationary measures because of the tariffs. We're going to see inflation because somebody's covering those costs, whether it's the business or the consumer, but it's an inflationary thing. So the question then is going to become whether or not the long-term strategy of these policies are going to reduce inflation.
Yeah.
If it does, then you'll start seeing people putting more money, investors putting more money into those bonds, into the 10-year bond, right? Or 20 or 30, the long-term bonds, because they're going to want to buy bonds today because
they know the inflation is going to help make them more valuable later.
If inflation continues to go, people are going to sell out of their bond. If long-term inflation is expected to be here, they're going to sell out of those long-term bonds because the investors are going to demand higher returns.
Yeah, but
compensate.
But doesn't that depend on how the market performs? If the market is highly volatile, then even if you're seeing a performance that's not necessarily as attractive in the bond market, you at least have the consistency of that return. Like,
say that again.
So let's say, for example, you have you'll have to help me because I'm not as familiar with this as you are. But like, if the market, for example, is highly volatile, right? I have cash and I want to put it in somewhere where I know I'm going to get a return. And I know the market's highly volatile. If I invest in the market, I could make a lot of money, but it's highly volatile. I could also lose a lot of money, right? But I know that if I'm looking for security and the bond market is, even if it's weak, but it's still not volatile, then I might be okay to still put my money in bonds, because I know that even though it's not going to be a great return, it's way better than the volatility that I'm seeing in the markets.
Right.
So then, even if there's a negative sentiment on inflation in futures, right, in the 10-year Treasury bond, like, wouldn't that still be a place where people will go to for security if the markets are unstable?
They could, but there's also shorter term bonds that they go into.
Oh, I see.
Right. So like you could go into 1-year Treasury bonds, 3-year Treasury bonds, 5-year Treasury bonds. The 10-year Treasury bond is kind of like the barometer that, mortgage rates typically follow, credit card rates typically follow. So if you've got volatility happening in the markets, and if you're an investor and you don't necessarily have confidence that inflation is going to look better in the long term, you're not necessarily going to invest your money into the 10-year Treasury, right? Because you'll put your money in it here at this yield, and prices of bonds and yields on bonds are inversely correlated, right?
I see.
So it's like if you have a bond and it's $100, it provides it. I sell it to you. The face value of the bond is $100.
Okay.
Right. But I demand a return on it. And I'm going to sell it to you. So I'm going to sell it to you. I'm trying to, because it's always backwards thinking. So if I want a 5% return on that, that means that the bond is going to be worth less, because I'm going to pay you $95 for that bond today, so that when it matures,
I see,
it's at 100, right? So if investors are going to have a less favorable outlook on long-term economic outlooks, they're not going to buy long-term bonds at 5%, because if inflation continues to go, investors are going to demand higher returns, which is going to push the price of the bond lower in order to get the yield that the investor wants.
It's like buying futures.
Correct. Yeah, you're it's kind of like, so they're just inversely related. Yeah. So if there's volatility in the financial markets right now, in the equities markets, and they're like, oh, I don't want to take all that risk, I'm going to put my money into something more secure. It's not just, I'm just going to put it in this bond. It's like, am I going to do short-term bonds, long-term bonds?
Right.
If the uncertainty of the economy from an inflationary standpoint is really uncertain, they're going to be less likely to invest in the longer-term bonds. They're going to put their money in the shorter-term bonds.
I see.
Right? Because it doesn't have as much, the duration of those bonds, it's not impacted as much.
I gotcha. Now, I will say what was interesting is I saw this morning, at least,
it was a super long roundabout way.
Yeah. At least as of this morning, 10 and 1-year Treasury bonds are up. So we're definitely seeing like a lot more activity in investors are clearly deciding to like go into that. So yeah. I don't. It's interesting, because I would love to know if this is like what their strategy is or not.
I don't know if we're gonna know.
I don't know if we're gonna know.
We're gonna know when it plays out.
Yeah. And well, you know what's funny is, like, even if it plays out, like, that may have not been their strategy, but they're probably still gonna be like, that was our strategy the whole time.
That was totally their strategy. But we couldn't tell you about it because you don't show your cards.
Exactly. Well, I mean, that is not uncommon.
I mean, it's a valid argument.
I mean, that's not uncommon for Trump, though. Like, we've heard this before, where Trump doesn't want to share strategy. He doesn't want to share. I don't want to talk about what I'm going to be doing or how I'm going to negotiate. Yeah. And I mean, that's fair. Like, you hear a lot of these like news media outlets are talking to him. Well, how are you going to negotiate with Iran? And like, what's the strategy you're going to take? He's like, well, I don't want to tell you. Like, and that makes sense.
Yes. I get that. I'm not a huge fan of the guy, but it totally like I can't tell you the strategy before I worked it.
Then they're going to know. Like, hello.
Oh, so that's what he was thinking. Joke's on you, sir.
Like, that's just funny. Like, oh, the way they got us is they just watched our news, right?
Yeah.
So I totally get that, and I could totally see that being a thing that he doesn't want to share, especially if there's a immediate pain point that the average American is likely to see, especially within the short term. What I wonder is like, because I know that there's this refinancing of debt that is due, that has to happen, I think, by June. I think that's the time frame. Mm-hmm. Has to happen by June. So if I would say that the markets have all of this has to happen. All this sort of the strategist tanking of the market, all of that has to happen by June. Like there has to be like really heavy pain points by June. What I'm wondering is, and I heard a pundit kind of talk about this, and I don't know how true this is, but I can see that, where he was saying that typically there's about a 14-month cycle before people just like, okay, whatever you're doing is you need to fix this. So in other words, if we're looking at 14 months from the time that he started in January, we're looking at maybe February, March, right? Time frame. Like where are we, right?
And so people start evaluating whether or not is this the right course?
Was this the right course? Are we in a better place now? Like, is he going to be able to, like, is the administration, I want to say him and the administration, is the administration going to be able to like showcase this time next year that, hey, we did this and this and this, and here we are now, we're in a better place. We're good to continue moving forward, because if he doesn't, then there's going to be a swing of like, all of the House and Senate elections. They're going to swing back over to the left.
Midterms are next year, right?
Yeah. So then all of a sudden he's not going to have any power to do anything. He's going to be basically in a deadlock for most of the things that he wants to do, right? Because the Democrats are certainly not going to be favorable. Mm-hmm. They're not even trying to play ball with him.
Yeah.
So, he's going to have to really showcase, like, in a year, like, hey, and in that time, there has to be some like wins, some real wins in the economy or something for the average American to feel like, oh, this is working. So I'm interested to see like what that's going to ultimately look like. Because even if this is the strategy, even if that's his plan, like, this seems like a longer term strategy that we won't see necessarily fully fleshed out anything next year, right? Because let's say, for example, hypothetically, the idea is to get manufacturing back here. Like, it's going to take more than 14 months to get a company to, let's say they make the decision today. They got to find a piece of land, or they have a warehouse or a building to even put people in the first place. They're going to have to do renovations. They're going to have to get pool permits. From the real estate side of it, which is what I'm familiar with, like that whole process.
That's a long process.
Yeah,
it's not single family homes we're talking about here.
Yeah, like exactly. Like, it's not going to be 30 days and now they're there. Like it's going to take a long time. Like it could easily take 2 years to get, especially if you're talking about any kind of manufacturing plan or distribution center or whatever, like it's going to take a long time to build that out, like to put in all the equipment and machinery and hire, and that's after you've even gotten into the real estate. The real estate alone would take 1.5 to 2 years just to get the real estate part done. You know what I mean? So like, unless they get into a place that already has everything they need, and they just got to put equipment and put people in it, which, I mean, that's really difficult to find. You know what I mean? I mean, most of the manufacturing plants have either been demolished or been abandoned for so long that they're not. It's going to take time to get them back up to.
They might be malls now.
Yeah, right.
But those are empty too, actually.
So I think that there is like the time horizon for implementation is long. So what will we see in the short term, which would be 1 year to 14 months, right? About a year from now, what are we going to see that is going to at least demonstrate that this is the right course of action?
I mean, if I'm going to be honest, I don't necessarily think that's. He's a master marketer, and I don't really think that it's necessarily going to be that difficult to illustrate like forward momentum, simply because of in my opinion, the Democratic Party's lack of momentum. Like, I feel like there's so many fronts that he could win on, right? You've got the Israel thing, you've got Ukraine, you've got tariffs, you've got
you know what? But
all of this stuff.
But none of that matters Like, we can talk about that now, but in a year from now, what's going to matter is like, how much is it costing me to live my life?
Sure.
Like, people's like lived experience is going to matter.
Right. But to your point, like he's already positioning this as short-term pain for long-term gain. So the question then becomes, what is short-term in an American's mind? And if he gets other wins that haven't been able to be won, like, I mean, not for anything, like I get that the wars don't really put anything in our pockets, but it's been points of contention for the last 4 years, right?
Yes.
So like, I feel like if he makes moves on that, he's considered a deal maker.
I get it, but
I think that we're underestimating. I think that it would be underestimating his ability to showcase those as strong enough wins to continue moving forward.
Yeah, but the problem is that you have to convince. I don't think he's going to have a hard time convincing his base and even potentially Republicans. I think what he's going to have a hard time convincing is the middle of the road people. They were like, you know what, we're going to give this a try because the other guys are not doing it. And this guy is definitely out of the box. And we're going to go ahead and give this a try, which was one of the reasons why he won the election, is because he got the people that were not necessarily affiliated to vote for him.
Well, then that's also going to come down to who the Democratic Party's nominee is going to be, if they can find a strong candidate who can counter that, I feel. Because
remember, for the midterms, that's not going to matter.
Oh, we're talking about midterms.
Yeah, for the midterms, that's not going to matter.
I guess as of right now, it doesn't even matter because he doesn't have another.
He doesn't have another. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, so for the next 4 years, he's the guy. The question is how much is he going to be able to do in his 4 years?
The other houses,
right? And then the only way he can stay doing what he's doing effectively, right, is that he continues to have a majority in both houses. If he doesn't have a majority in both houses, they're going to lock him down. They're going to prevent him in every way possible from doing a bunch of this stuff.
So we're just back to the status quo.
Yeah, we're back to status quo again.
Fantastic. Where nothing happens.
Exactly. So that's not helpful either. So, not that I want to, nosedive into oblivion, but he's at least trying something different. And it's definitely shaking the world up. I mean, look, the tariff thing that people were like up in arms about, I think there's almost 70 countries right now that already like renegotiated their tariff situation, right, to make this work. Like, he did that in over a week.
Yeah. Well, it's crazy because like, I don't think that it's any secret that like I'm not a fan of the guy from his approach and personality and stuff. At the same time, like, I'm not rooting against him.
Yeah.
Like, because to your point, right, it's that, I hope it works. As much as it pains me to like him have the credit for that, because I'm just not a fan of him personally.
Right.
But at the end of the day,
I'm a fan of the United States.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like, if you're asking me to the point, if the scenario comes out to where it's like, it either works or we get to a part next year after midterms where we're just in lockdown for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
If you're asking me what scenario I would rather find ourselves in, is I'd rather find ourselves in the scenario where progress is happening.
Yeah.
And
even if it's progress that we're not sure that's going to work, it's better than nothing.
Or even if it's progress from somebody who I'm not a huge fan of. Like, I'm not a fan of the debt. I'm not a fan of both parties having been just like at odds at each other and fighting. And while I don't care necessarily for the approach or some of the things that, they may be pushing, if, I can't say that I wouldn't be rooting that. I still am rooting for a favorable outcome.
Yeah, I would agree.
Just like, period. I'm rooting for a favorable outcome. And I'm rooting for the fact that like we find ourselves in a better position, and then maybe it just kind of like strikes a chord with everybody across. Even I'm not expecting Democrats and Republicans to like share the same thing, but if it worked, maybe it's that kind of that switch to where it's like now people are looking at things differently, and we start realizing that there's something that we can kind of come in common with, because we saw actual positive movement and momentum that help benefit the country. So it's like the approach may be different on how it is, but maybe it'll switch kind of like, what we consider the issues of the day, if you will. Because I mean,
I don't know if the issues of the day will necessarily change because, everything is hyperbole. So there, it's like, what is going to get people to react? I mean, I think that a lot of the issues that you see in the news, like what's going to get people to
because we're emotional creatures. We got to strike the emotional.
So chord. Like
that's a lot of people out to the voters.
Yeah. And a lot of the nuance that is actually important in the political hemisphere and global geopolitics is not exciting, right? It's just not exciting stuff to be like on the news, right? So, but it's important. BRICS, for example, remember the whole BRICS thing? Like that was a thing that people probably should have been at least aware of. And most people just had no clue of what was going on with like BRICS nations trying to develop another alternative to the dollar and trading, in not dollars and, stuff like that.
A huge, large trading block.
That could potentially, compete against U.S., global positioning. But nobody really had an understanding of that. Like there was very few people that I talked to that were like, oh yeah, I know exactly what's happening with that.
But I would blame that on
But this my point is that
I get your point.
It's not an exciting topic to talk about.
But I think that's the news job. I would argue that that's the news media's job to position it in a way to where it is exciting or it does become relevant, right?
Yeah, but
instead of attacking.
Yeah, but you can't make an enemy of your political opponent that way. And the news has been very party affiliated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
With kind of like where it's at, which is again where like I've been exploring now more off news.
Yeah. Alternative
outlets, right? But like again, to kind of point of conversation that we had on one of the other earlier podcasts is just kind of like, just because we don't necessarily trust the TV news or the mainstream media doesn't by default or de facto make the other alternative streams of information that we're receiving factual.
Oh, that's fair.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And I think that there's that misnomer that a lot of people, and it's just because you can't trust this, so now all of it is not true.
Right, Then all of it is
all
true.
Of this is true.
Yeah. It's not black or white.
It's not black or white. Yeah. Whereas what I've been appreciating, like, on the podcast or just the YouTube channels, is that you're just getting more conversational discussion around topics.
Yeah.
Right. To where it's like, so you're starting to get more perspective on different viewpoints that aren't, again, polarized for the purpose of pitting you against another side.
Right,
it's kind of like there's not, it's almost kind of reflects. It's not like they're arguing for a party or a side. Like, I mean, even like I like that Chris Cuomo one that I was watching. He even said, he's like, I'm not a fan of like the Democratic Party. It's not the Democratic Party of my father. Right?
Sure.
And the way we hear that all the time. I've heard that on the Republican Party. This is the Republican Party of my parents, or whatever it is. Right. But so they're having these conversations not necessarily from a position of party affiliation, but they're having these conversations from a position of differing perspective and approach of an issue.
Yeah.
Which I think is much needed. And
we need to have more of that. I mean, and again, this also goes back to like how can we have these sort of deeper conversations to have a better understanding of like what is ultimately going on and how does that affect you and I, right?
Yeah.
In terms of like what are, what's going to happen with our income, what's going to happen with our expenses, like how is that going to impact our day to day, all that good stuff. And I mean, the market tanks, right? And then like, how does that affect me? Like, it didn't really affect me very much because I'm not in the market. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, it affected my portfolio, but it doesn't affect me because I'm not doing anything with it.
Right. So, but I guess my point is like the day-to-day stuff though is like didn't change the price of gas much, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
The stuff that you're living off.
Did still cost about the same as far as I could tell, right? So there's not been like these swings in like cost of goods because the market has sort of like shifted. So all this talk about the market shifting is like, these are like not real dollars that are kind of being played in a system based on confidence in the system, and that portion of the system there's not a lot of confidence in. So then how does that translate to the economy? And right now it's not really translating at the moment, right?
Yeah.
So how the news approaches this is like really they're trying to find the thing that is the most exciting part and showcasing that, which is why I think you're hearing on the right side is like, oh my God, the market's tanking just like we planned. And the left side is like, oh my God, the market's tanking. It's a catastrophe, right? And everything is like catastrophized or like, this is the best thing since sliced bread. Mm-hmm. So, I would like to see more of those kind of conversations. So I'm liking that I'm seeing a lot more of those kinds of interview style. Mm-hmm. So that, that's kind of the reason why we're trying to have a conversation. It's like just to have more dialogue about like what is going on and how that ultimately affects the average American. I am interested in getting your take on, so like just a slight switch of topic is, China has retaliated as it relates to tariffs. Did you hear about this?
They retaliated, and then we just stacked on like
we doubled
50% tariff back on them.
Well, 50% on top of what we were already doing.
Yes, exactly.
So it's like 104%, I think, is the current tariff now for all Chinese goods. And I wonder, and there are some people who are like, oh, that's terrible. That's going to not work in our favor. And other people are like, that's a mistake that China's making. So I don't know who has leverage there, because obviously China makes a lot of our shit, right? Mm-hmm. So there's leverage, but we buy all of that. And they make money off of like our ability to buy all of their shit. So does the rest of the world, can they make up the difference? Right, in terms of like here's the thing, because China is like is a government that it's basically ruled by like single party, right? Government, and she has essentially emperor level rule, right? Yeah. It's a democracy, but it's really that. It's not really, right? So he kind of says what it is, and the Chinese population is very much just, hey, that's fine. We're fine with this type of government. It's fine.
They're in step with it.
Yeah, they're fine with that. So because he has that kind of power, like he could, even if it was more painful for the Chinese to take a hit from the tariffs income-wise, like they're a big enough economy that they could probably take the hit for a long time, feel the pain, and then he could just say, well, we're just going to feel the pain, and everyone in China can be like, okay. And he might even be able to subsidize them in the short term. Like the United States wouldn't be able to get away with that for very long, because we have a true like a democratic view of things, and the people ultimately will respond by voting out the people that voting out congressional people that they think are not in alignment, and voting people they think will be more in alignment with benefiting their immediate needs. So I even though it's possible that it could be more painful for China, I think China has the ability to, out of principle, just say, well, we're just going to stay. We're fine with your 104% tariffs. See how you can live without Chinese products. And it'll suck for us for a little while, but you know what? My people will be okay.
So I think you brought up a good point, and kind of shares kind of like my overall, and I'll disclaimer, I'm not super knowledgeable and expert on like what the Chinese economy and stuff like looks like, right?
But they're the second largest economy,
right? Well, I mean, I know that, but I just mean like how. Here's my thoughts on that. My thoughts is that yes, China can weather that storm much better and much longer than us in America.
Only because
of the way that their government is set up.
Correct.
Right? Like we have a republic.
Right. It's a type of democracy.
It's a type of democracy.
It's a type,
right? For those out there who are saying
that
you don't want to,
Constitutional republic. Yeah, we agree.
Constitutional republic. And we also have more free markets here. Like to your point, like he can subsidize, and they already do it.
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
They can choose the bank that they're going to use. Yep. They can force them to make the loans.
Yep.
and they can subsidize those. So it's like, as far as like the tariffs, like, and China is, they own a lot of our debt.
Oh, for sure.
Right. Like, I would say that they're
positioned well.
They're positioned very well. Yeah. So they have the resources and the assets to be able to weather the pain of this. Right.
And they, I think, more of a willingness.
Sure. Yeah. Out of principle.
Yeah.
So, I think that it's going to come down to whether or not deals can be made with other countries from trade perspective. And then if the United States finds itself in a position of power to put pressure
on those
countries to put pressure on China.
Yes.
Otherwise, Americans are going to falter before the Chinese people.
They would have to.
They would have to, especially if it's affecting prices and
Absolutely.
Living and all of this.
Because
to your point, we can't move manufacturing or the necessary manufacturing and get it up and running
in enough time,
and
still be potentially even be able to afford the things that we're making. I mean, I think that this idea. I think on principle, the idea of, hey, tariffs will hurt China more than they hurt the United States. I think it's true. I think it will hurt China more than it hurts the United States. The difference is China has more tolerance for pain than the United States does.
Yes.
Right? Because Xi can essentially say, we're going to take this pain, and his people are going to be like, okay, fine, we'll take the pain. Mm-hmm. Right? Because, I mean, to his defense, not that I'm for like that type of rule, but he's brought that economy from like
nothing.
Yeah, like it was third world country to being the second biggest economy in the world. So like, I'm sure his people have a lot of confidence in his ability to rule.
And that's because of the structure of their government. There's no way that we would have been able to do that.
Oh, no, not at all.
Because there's not
He forced his way into it. He forced all that to happen. Correct. Yeah, for sure.
But everybody there is better off because of it.
Yeah.
Which is why they throw so much support towards that, which is it's understandable.
Yeah.
Totally understandable.
Not the way that I would prefer to have a governance, but I understand why that's working for them, right? Like the one thing democracies tend to be, any kind of democracy tends to be slow moving, not nimble, right? All that good stuff. But the idea is that you tend to have more humanitarian, elements, and you tend to be, like there's a lot of benefit to democracies, but one of the downfalls is that it's not nimble, it can't move very fast, right?
Yeah.
The totalitarian regimes don't have the humanitarian element. They don't have some of these benefits for in terms of how free markets work and stuff like that. But they do have the benefit, not to say that totalitarian regimes are beneficial, but they do have a benefit, and the benefit is like whatever the top says, the rest follow.
Yeah.
And they can move.
They can move in a dime.
Because they just say, okay, well, whatever he says goes. That's it. There's the people have to decide or agree with, or if they disagree with, like, that's not a thing.
Yeah.
Like, you just do whatever the boss says is basically how it goes. So they have the ability to be nimble in that regard. They also have the ability to just like take that pain over time. And even though it is financially more painful for the Chinese than it is for the Americans just don't have the tolerance for that pain.
And I don't know if it's the strategy, but I would say, there's people who say it was a mistake for them to tariff. And I don't really have like a position one way or the other, whether or not it was a bad thing for them to implement additional tariffs or if it was a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I would say if I'm thinking of a strategy, if I were implementing a strategy, a reason why I would do that or think that I'm going to give myself leverage is that I'm going to start there. I'm going to war with them, a trade right now with tariffs, and I'm going to stack on these huge tariffs while I start. The goal is not to negotiate with China.
Yeah.
The goal is just to continue to put pressure on China.
Oh, for sure.
The goal is to negotiate with the other trading partners.
Yeah.
So that when we start talking with them, and then if we have the leverage and put ourselves in the position to start pressuring them to put it on China,
correct.
We've got these, the largest consumer economy in the world already has these massive tariffs.
Yeah. And
now you've got all of the other economies putting pressure on theirs. And so then it's going to start pinching.
Yeah. That would be my strategy. I mean, and that's, and I don't know what they're negotiating. I don't know what the administration is negotiating, but if they're negotiating, hey, part of our deal is that you also keep reciprocal tariffs, whatever tariffs that the United States has, you do the same thing with China as well. Like that would be game changer, because then, to your point, that is going to put China in a position where, like, holy crap, like I can't trade with anybody. They're not going to be able to sustain that, because now the global access, they're going to be limited in terms of their global access to a variety of different countries. I mean,
that would also assume that the stuff that we rely so heavily in other economies rely so heavily on China. That also assumes that there is now alternative means for consumers in those places to get those products.
But there are, though. Like you have India, you have Vietnam, you have Mexico.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a lot of countries that are manufacturing, that have a lot of manufacturing capacity, right? So like what I would do is, and again, I'm not the president, so my decision is irrelevant. But I mean, like, I love this idea that you're talking about, where like you go to these other nations and you're like, hey, listen, Vietnam, you know what, we've negotiated zero tariffs both ways. However, we would like you to expand your manufacturing into these other areas. We'll help you to develop the stuff that China's building, right? So that you can have more trade ability in other nations, because clearly China's being a little bit difficult. And we would like you to also put pressure on China to also be a fair trading partner with not only us, but everyone else in the world, right? Like that seems like that would be a good trading position if the United States can negotiate those things. You know what I mean? So I don't, it'd be interesting to see like how they're positioning those trade negotiations, to see if that is a part of it, because the United States is not going to be able to compete with China from a manufacturing perspective. We're just not, right?
No.
So even if we brought manufacturing here, we just would not be able to compete from a manufacturing perspective. But we do have, to your point, the biggest consumer base in the world. So that would, as a country, like that would give us some leverage against, with other nations that are trading with us, to be able to talk to them about, hey, listen, if you want to keep access to our consumer base, you're going to need to do something about China, because that's going to be we're seeing that as a problem. So I'm interested to see how that kind of plays itself out.
I'm also interested to see how, so with the investment of, the administration trying to push manufacturing back to America, they clearly have a long-term perspective that manufacturing is not going anywhere from a manufacturing job perspective, right? Yeah. But there's a theory, and I can't remember exactly what it's called. There's a theory in economics. I don't know if it's considered a theory or not, but what is it? It's like you have like relative competitiveness, I think is what it's called, and superior competitiveness. And it has to do with trade. So it has to do with the fact that it's like I can make, if I'm going to use like farming as an example, right? It's like I can make corn and I can make potatoes. And you make corn and you can make potatoes. But you're more efficient at farming corn per unit.
Okay.
And I'm more efficient at farming potatoes per unit.
Okay.
So where trade comes into play is that it's more productive for me to make less corn and produce more potatoes.
Sure.
And trade my potatoes for your corn, and you make more corn and you make less potatoes.
Sure.
Because our efficiencies, we can make more per unit and the cost per unit is less.
Yeah,
so that's like the basis of like economic and trade.
Now you're talking about that's relative.
I can't remember. I have to come back. Yeah, I think it's, so you've got like, I can't remember what the terms are. I think it's relative.
And then what would be the alternative to that?
What do you mean the alternative?
You said there's like a superior trade or whatever.
Well, I think that's what I mean. So you're superior at this one thing.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So why would you try and make both things if somebody else makes this one better than you?
Better, faster, less expensive.
And you can trade
right.
additional goods around that. So then
it's cheaper for you to just trade. Cheaper.
So then the overall market economy becomes more efficient. The
Which is kind
resources required become utilized more efficiently.
Well, that's the idea of like global trade, is that certain nations are going to be better at certain things than others.
So I think it just happens to be that China happens to be very good at certain things. They just happen not to be the best, I would say, maybe ideologic ally. We have a lot of challenges with like the way that we see the world. Is like completely different. So it's like it becomes a difficult trading partner that we very much heavily rely on because of how everything's happened. So it's kind of like, well, I don't think that we'll go there, but I think that we also need to keep in mind it's like the goal is not to bring everything back to America. I think the goal is to bring certain things back and also identify strategic trading partners that have aligned visions with, say, ideologically.
You think that I don't know if ideologically I don't know if
that's the right word.
I don't know if ideological visions need to be in alignment in order for, because I mean you're talking about like how I think about the world versus like how our economies trade, and I don't know that as long as your worldview isn't to conquer the world.
That's what I'm talking about. You know what I'm saying? That's a better.
Then I would say that I could, you could be a trade partner with someone who's not necessarily your friend, right? Because there's just money. We're trying to just
because goods. I would say it was like, if China or Russia ended up getting huge economic status and we're just these massive powerhouses that like nobody could compete against, or even from a military perspective, like. If you had Russia and China in that position, or you had America and Europe in that position, and everything else was equal, who do you think would try? I would argue that I feel like Russia and China, just based on like how we've been made to view them, right? There's a greater risk that they would try and take over like other areas
militarily.
I think so.
I don't know about that.
I think that, or try and push economic pressure to try and move their control further into the world.
That's
I'm not
reasonable.
saying that they're going to go and like start going to military war, but they're going to start trying to push their influence of control across. And I feel like Europe and the United States, maybe barring outside of the Middle East, right, with us in the Middle East, like respect autonomy of nations.
Yeah, I mean
a little bit more.
Well, I mean. That's a whole other conversation to have.
That's why we have a series.
Yeah, I think that I think Russia and China are really more interested in economic power at this stage than they are necessarily in like having, or maybe influence could be argued, right?
Economic power is influence.
No, I know. I'm saying they could arguably have more of an interest in economic power and influence than they do over like having control over more landmass, right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So I think that is really what would be the driving factors there. And the United States is the same. We're trying to do economic power and influence. That's what our goal is, right? So all the major nations that are players are trying to have more economic power, more influence in the world. The question is who's going to be able to do that in a way that gets everybody else to agree that, yeah, you know what, I'm okay with that person having the most influence, right? I mean, arguably the United States, because we're a democracy, and we're supposed to, theoretically, we're supposed to be run by the people, even though that there's a whole other conversation to be had about that. You can make an argument that it's the best system for like the ones who have the most influence, where the people ultimately influence the governance, right? And how the government functions. And that is the system that seems to be the most reasonable to have the most influence versus having just sort of a totalitarian single person, because that relies on hoping that totalitarian is going to be a kind and equitable person with other nations, right? And if they're not, then you're in big trouble because they have the most influence. They have the most influence, right? So you don't want to necessarily have that singularity of influence. Correct. Yeah. So like having a sort of some kind of a democracy be the highest influencer in the world seems to be the safest system. Sure. Like whether or not that person let's say Trump, if you were to argue, oh, well, Trump is a terrible person to be in that seat. Okay, you can make that case, but he's only going to be in that seat no more than 8 years. Yeah. Right. And then after 8 years, we can put someone else in. Yeah. Where totalitarian, they're there until they decide to leave or they're killed. Like that's the alternative, right? So still, this is a better system because even if that person ends up being a totalitarian in principle, they're only there for 8 years,
right,
at most, and then they're gone, and then you put in someone else. So I still think that the driving, I guess, goal is they're all trying to vie for who's going to be the most influential. Right now, the United States happens to be, but China and Russia, I think, are trying to make efforts to also be sort of in that seat. And if the United States doesn't play it right, I mean, it's possible that China could be the next player in that regard, which could. I would just be wary of a totalitarian regime having that kind of influence in the global hemisphere. So, but it is. But I will say it is interesting that one thing that's not being talked a lot about. Well, I guess they're talking a little bit is that Trump is having conversations with Iran, and Trump is having conversations with Russia. Like he's going to talk to the leaders of these nations that are clearly not in alignment with the United States, but he's still wanting to sit down with them to kind of talk about hey, how can we work together?
Well, I think that's kind of been lost with the divisiveness that has just been coming out. It's like, when did it become looked down upon to sit down and talk with the people who are on the other side of the table?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that just doesn't even make a whole lot of sense.
That's the whole point of diplomacy.
We're in real estate, right? Yeah. If I'm representing a seller, sell their home, I have to talk to the buyer.
Yeah.
Who's on the other side of the table. Yeah. They're against me in the negotiation, but it's I still need to
we have to have a conversation.
Otherwise
the deal doesn't happen.
It never happens.
Yeah.
Right? And whether or not, and you could argue it's oh, well, we can have those conversations with our allies or whatever who just have differing opinions and we're negotiating on that. Was that I would say was that would be the difference. That would be the same thing as me having a conversation with you who has a buyer who's wanting to negotiate not that far off of what we're asking versus somebody who's throwing a low ball, kind of an unreasonable offer, are we just not going to have a conversation with them simply because
it's a lower offer?
Yeah, or because we're just so far off. So I don't know. I think that those are conversations. I think that those are conversations that are important that are not happening in the main news, like I had mentioned. That I hate to keep beating a dead horse, but that I'm finding are happening more on conversational style interview processes. That we're having.
Well, this is why I think this whole trade thing that's happening, this tariff thing. I think that if Trump is obviously he's leading with these tariffs, and if he's talking to Iran and he's talking to Russia, and in those conversations, he's hey, what if we, work with you guys to not have these tariffs, open up more trade routes for you. In exchange, you don't do business with China. You don't do he is trying to find ways to I don't know if he is. I'm just saying if that was the strategy that he's trying to find ways to be more friendly with these adversaries so that we can all kind of work, against China and what they're trying to do, that would be beneficial for the United States. Because to your point of what you were saying before, if the idea is, tariffs to everyone so that we can negotiate a deal, and part of that negotiation is also to continue to put pressure on China to actually play fair, because one of the biggest issues with China is the intellectual property rights that they're just taking. Now they've put recently more restrictive measures on that, but they've also taken that off the table considering the new tariffs in place. Right? They're oh, well then we don't care about intellectual property anymore. We're just going to go ahead and just make everything right. So if he can negotiate pressure on China where China has to acquiesce, then that could ultimately be beneficial to the United States economy long term. Again, this plays back to are we going to see some positivity play back over the next year? And if we can see positivity play back over the next year, he's going to have momentum moving into the rest of his presidency. If If we don't see that momentum, then there's a good chance that the Republicans are going to be voted out at the House and Senate level, and they're going to be replaced by Democrats, and then he's going to basically be locked down. He's going to be ultimately lame duck. He's not going to be able to get anything done. Yeah. The Congress is going to hold him up. So his opportunity to do something is like he's got 12 months to show I think he has got 12 months to show the American people, like, hey, this is working. And if you can't impact Americans where they're at in a year, like, I think he's gonna have trouble staying in any position to be able to make some stuff happen over the rest of his presidency. So I think he's got a year to kind of showcase something. Now, I will say he's moving fast on a lot of stuff. So right now he is showcasing stuff, but it's not necessarily impacting people's pockets. Mm-hmm. And right now it's just, you can get away with the marketing part and be like, oh, look what I'm doing. Look what I'm doing. Look what I'm doing. But a year from now, if people are hurting, I don't think they're going to care. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Like if my wages are still the same, or if groceries have gotten more expensive, or if it's just more, it's harder for me to live a year from now, they're not going to care. They're like, nope, this is not working. I can't deal with this. I'm already paycheck to paycheck. There's no way I can continue living like this. Like, it's getting worse. Yeah. We need to find another solution. They're gonna vote out the party that's in. Right. They're gonna do that. So I think he's got a year. That's sort of my thought on it. All right. So, anyways, I know we're supposed to be here for an hour. I don't know where we're at now. Are we at an hour? Longer than an hour. Oh, a little over an hour. Okay. Two people who talk too much. Yeah. Right. Same thing. So hey, listen. Those are my thoughts. Those are your thoughts. Anything else to kind of wrap up on that? No. All right. Cool. Really. Hey, listen. If you guys like what you're hearing, we're just two guys having a conversation about what's going on in geopolitics and just generally what we're seeing in our lives and how it ultimately impacts us. We'd love to hear any comments you have, any thoughts, if you agree or disagree, or anything that you'd like us to kind of talk about, any topics you want us to kind of chat about. We'd love to just hear about it. Please make sure you comment below. Please please share. We appreciate you. This has been the Anomaly Podcast. I appreciate your time. We'll see you guys next time. Peace. Sweet.